Alignments in D&D are an abstraction. They simplify the idea of day-to-day morality, and as such, they're surprisingly complicated to understand for their simplicity. I think that's because morality is something that we deal with in our lives on a daily basis, even if we don't think about it consciously. That to have it kind of put in this little box and brought down to size so we can deal with it in a game, it's hard to nail down and it's hard to think about.
Yeah, for sure. And the alignment system is really involved from a very simple, classic high fantasy, one-dimensional idea to something a little bit more complex in the D&D system.
Yeah. So it went from something probably, as much as they deny Lord of the Rings inspiration for OD&D, it's definitely there. There were hobbits in OD&D before they had to change the name to halflings. So we know those guys were reading those books,
Right.
right? And that type of high fantasy where good and evil is really black and white feels like where the game started out. As opposed to later, today, the system allows you to play like a Robin Hood type of character.
Right.
Who's going around breaking laws in order to help people not starve to death, which is a little more morally complicated.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it all started in 1974 when original D&D, which of course was just D&D back then. This is kind of like Star Wars A New Hope. It was just Star Wars when it came out in the 70s. We now call this OD&D or original D&D. It just had lawful, neutral, and chaotic. The idea of lawful was different in that edition than we would look at it now and in the later editions, the way they made it. Because the idea was a simple one, is good people follow the laws, and the presumption is that the laws are good for society. So if you're trying to do unselfish good things for society, you're probably following laws. Not even specific laws, it was just this general idea. Really, the opposite of chaos. Chaos was the way that it is in the Warhammer settings. Chaos just means whatever kind of evil. You're going to break the laws because the laws don't help you. And you're chaotic because you're chaotic. There's this old world presumption and trust in systems of law that's kind of built into that idea. But then in 77, when they came out with the D&D basic set, that's where alignments as we know them today got introduced. So first in OD&D, we just had this one axis that went from lawful to chaotic and encompassed everything the way we think about it today. The D&D basic set introduced the two-axis system. So there is the axis of law versus chaos and the axis of good versus evil, and they aren't necessarily the same. A little bit of complexity was introduced, but that complexity, I think, is still true to high fantasy battle of good versus evil. So no longer is lawful assumed to always be good. Not all laws and not all codes are in the best interests of the people that they're supposed to serve. And the same is true of chaos. Sometimes you break laws to do things that we would commonly call good because they're unselfish or they help other people. Then later in 1977, advanced Dungeons & Dragons adopted this as well. So at that point, this two-axis system was here to stay, for the most part. And then in 2008, 4th edition came out, and we had a strange kind of blip in the continuity here. We still had something that was basically based on the two-axis system, but it removed some things. So all you had in this edition was lawful good, good, which is like neutral good, evil, which is like neutral evil in the classic system, chaotic evil, and unaligned, which is a lot like neutral neutral or true neutral in the classic system. But there was no lawful neutral, there was no chaotic neutral, there was no lawful evil. I didn't play 4th edition very much because frankly, I didn't like it. So I'm not really sure how all these things worked out in nuance. There were just less alignments, but still in the two-axis system is what I get out of all this. Then in 2014, 5th edition came out, and it restored the alignment system as we know it, but with the addition of unaligned. And that's just a little thing that means that certain types of creatures don't choose an alignment, like a wild bear. It's really neither good nor evil. It really doesn't have laws or any sense of chaos. You know, it does what it does, and sometimes it attacks for biological reasons, I guess.
Makes total sense.
Yes. It doesn't really have self-awareness the way that we think of it for human beings that we know of.
Yeah, 5th edition is actually where I came in. I didn't play any of the older editions. So that's actually a lot of changes that have come over the last, 50 years?
Yeah.
Of D&D.
Yes.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how it's taken all these different steps and then kind of undone some of it and then put it back. Two things that I think are misunderstood are the axes themselves. So what do they really mean when they call something good? What do they really mean when they call something evil? The word I see again and again is altruistic. I know it's there in 5th edition, and I want to say I've seen it there in other editions too. Altruistic, what do we really mean by that? Well, that means I'm willing to sacrifice my own needs for the greater needs of society when that's appropriate. The opposite of that would be I only give a crap about myself.
Right. Yeah.
In the D&D world, that's evil. So sociopathy, as you said earlier when, when we were talking, absolute sociopathy would be evil from a D&D point of view. And altruism, to the point of even laying down your life, if it's going to cause more good in the world.
Good would be your stereotypical, what a lot of people would say is your choir boy, where they do everything humanly possible to help others.
Yep. I brought cookies. I'm going to share them.
Yeah.
That's good.
Right. Yeah.
In a really heartworming way. And I picture a choir boy doing that.
Giving to the poor. Things like that.
Even when you don't have to.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good way to put it. So that's good and evil. It's selfishness versus unselfishness, I guess, or selflessness.
Right.
With neutral being, I don't want to harm people too much, but I also am not going to go out of my way to sacrifice myself. Neutral's probably, honestly, how most of us behave on the good and evil spectrum most of the time.
I would agree with that for sure.
Which doesn't necessarily make for an interesting heroic character. I think that's why a lot of people don't play true neutral. We'll get into law versus chaos next. But true neutral to me is what a normal person is in our modern society.
I don't know. I think it can make a very interesting heroic character.
That's true. You can. And when we get to our examples, we'll have some examples that aren't so mundane. Yeah, that's fair. So then there's the law versus chaos axis. And a thing that's commonly misunderstood with that is law doesn't mean that you always obey whatever law other people want you to be in obedience to. It doesn't always mean that you just accept the laws of the country that you're in.
Right.
It means that you have some kind of code. It could be the country's laws. It could be an organization's laws. It could be the laws of a criminal organization. But you don't break them most of the time. Most of the time you adhere to that code because that code is important to you. The adoption of that code means something to you. That could be your own code, but that code might be rigid. If it's unbendable and it's rulesy, that's law. It's easy to misunderstand because the word law is in there.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas chaos is the exact opposite of that. You flout every law. You have no moral code. You do whatever kind of fits the moment in your mind.
Yeah. You don't care about rules at all.
Yeah.
So there's been a relatively recent change with alignment acquisition in 5th edition, and I just don't know any better way to put that. But by alignment acquisition, I mean, how does a character come to the alignment that they have? It used to be, and throughout the history of the game, I want to say right until 5e, I think 4th edition had some difference here too. Even in the way that it began in 5th edition, a lot of creatures, by the nature of being that creature, had an alignment. How did they acquire the alignment? They were born that way. Red dragons, chromatic dragons in general, are evil, or used to be evil. Now they made a change. As of Monsters of the Multiverse, they use the word typically. So it isn't that they're born that way. It's just that, I guess, dragon culture. Dragons are loners. I don't know if they have a culture. Maybe their parentage, whatever it was, right? Culturally or societally or whatever has a strong tendency toward that. But it doesn't have to be that way. Now you can have the rare, good-aligned red dragon who is like, this is crap.
Yeah, it's removing that black and white from everything within the game.
Sure. And it's removing the idea. I think a lot of people are growing uncomfortable with this idea that, like, let's take an example. The black-skinned race of drow. Well, you're just evil. Because you're drow.
Yeah.
I understand the black skin isn't intended to be, like, the reason they're evil, but many of us are kind of growing uncomfortable with that idea.
Right.
Like, well, why do they have to,
Yeah.
It's bad enough they're black-skinned and evil.
Yeah.
Right? Now you're saying they're born that way. I just want to say something quickly about drow because I'm bringing up that I'm a little uncomfortable with the traditional idea that a black-skinned race of people are inherently evil. I am not trying to be performatively woke. I understand that that comes from much, much older mythology. I think Norse mythology. I don't think anyone consciously decided like, oh, let's talk about non-white skinned people. Well, of course they're evil. I don't think they meant it that way. It's just that in the age that we live in now, it's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah. I also wonder biologically, being in the dark, you would have paler skin.
True. True. In AAW's Rise of the Drow, they get around it all by making the drows purple.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool, actually.
Whatever. Yeah.
But yeah, it's not particularly biologically accurate, but it's a fantasy game. Yeah. And I recognize it isn't intended to be that way. But I do like that it now says typically. Also, if you like to play a character that's like Driss de Warden because you like that character, now you can.
I like the idea of playing a good aligned rider.
Okay. So now there are just a few types of beings who do not consciously choose alignments. Strong examples are devils. I think all devils are lawful evil, no matter what the variety is.
Yeah.
All demons are chaotic evil, no matter what the variety is. Devils are about law and doing bad stuff, and demons are about whatever I want to do and doing bad
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
And a lot of the angels, I think, still have alignments that they are
I
created
think
with.
many on
If
Mount
not-
Celestia as the plane are lawful good.
Right. The cosmological idea is that the gods created the mortal races, which would include elves in the D&D world. They're not immortal, they're just very long-lived. The gods created the mortal races with the ability to choose, but other types of beings don't have that.
Right.
It's more of a cosmological / mythological thing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the alignments we do have in 5th edition.
Obviously, alignments are extremely tricky to find, like a perfect example. So don't judge us for our examples here.
Yep.
We try to come up with things that we thought best fit each alignment, but obviously everybody has their own opinions, and you may not agree with some of the things that we have in here. If you have some better ones, let us know.
Yeah, leave a comment.
Yeah.
We'd love to talk about it. This is all very open to interpretation because, as I said earlier, this is a very abstracted form of morality. So it's helpful for us to make references from pop culture or other intellectual property or franchises because it helps get across an idea quicker. But also you could argue with every single one of them.
Right.
Because in any of these other franchises we're going to talk about, which are more about fiction, movies and novels and things, characters are way more fleshed out. And can be because they don't have to operate on something in a game system. So we can make them more complicated and interesting, but we'll take our best shot.
Yeah.
We'll also kind of talk about what each of the individual alignments really is. I'm just going to read out what the 5e manual says. So for lawful good, it says, can be counted on to do the right thing as expected by society. That's the important thing.
Right.
Both the right thing, but also as expected by society. Gold, but again, what society is the question? Doesn't mean the city I live in. It might mean my thieves guild. That's society, right? And it says gold dragons and paladins are typically, that's part of that new language they use, lawful good. An example we thought of is Superman.
Yep.
For the
I
most
think
part.
the most stereotypical example would be Superman.
Yeah.
He follows the laws of at least America in the comic books and does things that society would think are good in general.
Yeah. An example that might surprise some people a lot, and there's room for a different interpretation, but I think you can make a great case for Batman being lawful good. He is a vigilante. He definitely breaks the laws of Gotham City, and he breaks the laws of the United States all the time, but he has a moral code that's rules-based, that he will not violate. He doesn't kill, for the most part, right? There's a Dark Knight version that I think does do that.
Right, yeah.
But I'm thinking of classic Batman from Detective Comics. No guns, no killing. Or even in the Christopher Nolan movies. A lot is made of that. He will not use guns.
Right. And while he doesn't work outside of the law, he's typically doing good things. He's doing what society would think is good.
Yeah. The law is sometimes corrupt.
Yeah.
But not his code, not his law.
Right.
Yeah. Then there's neutral good. Rules as written say of neutral good, they do the best they can to help others according to their needs. Many celestials are neutral good. So an example I can think of is the Doctor in Doctor Who. He definitely has a code, but it's also really flexible. And I'm thinking especially of Classic Who, which I've seen the most of. The Doctor is a renegade Time Lord. He doesn't necessarily believe in any system, but he's also not chaotic either. He's definitely good, but he's flexible when it comes to codes and law.
Another one we kind of came up with is Doctor Strange. While an argument can be made that Doctor Strange is actually chaotic good, I would put him more in the neutral good category. He doesn't really have a code necessarily. He's just dealing with magical threats that attack our realm or the realm of Marvel.
And notably, he's not really against the idea of codes either. He doesn't just flout them, which would be chaotic. Yeah. I thought of Green Lantern also, who definitely believes in the code of the Green Lantern Corps. And this would be the Hal Jordan Green Lantern and the Kyle, I forget his last name. The new Green Lantern that people hated a lot that I actually liked. They believed in the code of the Corps, but they would bend it too. Guy Gardner especially would have bent to that code a lot. The only one who did not, I think, Well, John Stewart. The
Yeah.
John Stewart Green Lantern. I don't know. He's still kind of neutral good, I would say.
Mm.
Because he's not especially chaotic, but he's not also rigidly
I would
adhering
probably
to.
call him lawful good as a lantern.
Yeah? Do you think
Yeah.
he's well, he's got his own code, I guess, which is the
Yeah.
point I was making. It doesn't have to be the Green Lantern code now that I
Right.
think about it. He's got his own code. He's not as much of a cowboy.
Right.
Yeah. So about chaotic good, rules as written say that they act as their conscience directs with little regard for what others expect. Copper dragons and unicorns are typically chaotic good.
One of the examples we came up with this is Tyrion Lannister. He's typically doing things that end up being good, whether they're selfish at times or not. Well,
He's ultimately good.
He's ultimately good. And he has really no code to think of.
He doesn't like codes.
Yeah, he doesn't like codes.
And he has no regard for laws.
Right.
Yeah.
Or another example, if you watch anime, JoJo from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, at least the Stardust Crusade JoJo, I would say he has little to no
Code of his own?
yeah, but he's typically doing good and destroying evil in the process.
Sure. I can't speak to it. All I know about JoJo is, all right, lawful neutral. Rules say they act in accordance with law, tradition, or personal codes. Modrons and many wizards and monks are lawful neutral.
One of the examples, again, that we came up with this one is the Punisher. I think the Punisher has a specific code he follows,
For sure.
but doesn't always do good for that code or to justify that code or in the name of that code, but doesn't always do evil in the name of that code.
Yeah.
He'll do basically anything to get the job done.
Yeah. In ideal, a judge in a modern court system, I think, is the archetype of someone who's expected to be lawful neutral, at least in their capacity as a judge. Maybe not in their personal life, but that's the idea about justice, the blinder around Lady Justice and the scales. That's, to me, that image is very lawful neutral.
Yeah. And along that, kind of a combination of the two, Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd, again, follows a very strict code, but will do whatever it takes to follow that code.
Yeah, that code may result in good. It may result in evil. Doesn't matter. The code is the code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Follows it to the T.
Yes. Then there's neutral. The rules say that this is the alignment of those who prefer to steer clear of moral questions and don't take sides, doing what seems best at the time. Druids are traditionally neutral, as are typical townsfolk. There's a little bit of a history of the game perspective I want to bring in here that I don't think that particular quote takes into account, but I think is still part of the system. And that is people who believe in true neutrality. They even mention druids, and druids are often portrayed as being interested in the balance of things. So it isn't that they want to steer clear of moral questions and don't take sides, even though rules as written says that, right? Because that can be neutral. That can definitely be neutral.
Mm-hmm.
But it can also be a group or a person who's just interested in neutrality as an ideal, like a yin and yang thing.
Right. One of the examples we have here is just the Ents. I think that's the most used example for true neutral.
Mm-hmm.
They really just care about balance.
Yeah. They're the ultimate druids. In a way.
Right.
Magical or not, I guess. Yeah. I think that Star Trek's narrative voice in general, no particular character or organization in Star Trek, but if you could imagine the narrative voice of a franchise having an alignment, I think that it has a true neutral alignment. And it's expressed classically in Spock grappling with the law of his people, which is that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Even Spock sometimes acknowledges in these stories that sometimes the needs of the few or even the one are also important and need to be paid attention to, need to be accommodated.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to look at true neutral. One, you won't always choose the many. Sometimes the one matters more, and sometimes vice versa.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. That's a big moral question, the big philosophical question. But that's what it means in the game.
Yeah.
I think Lando Calrissian in Empire Strikes Back is a classic example of this. He did some things that turned out in a way he didn't intend, that did turn out more evil than he intended. But even so, he was willing to sell Han out. Even if he thought he could save him later, to put him through that kind of discomfort, to not tell him it was happening and let him have the mental suffering of thinking that his friend betrayed him. These things, to me, made Lando kind of neutral. He Clearly, he doesn't care about law, but he's also not interested in a bunch of chaos. He cares about law in terms of not getting caught.
Right, yeah.
And he does care about good and evil, but he's not so selfless. He's also not so evil. And there's chaotic neutral. The rules say that chaotic neutral characters follow their whims, holding their personal freedom above all else. Many rogues and bards are chaotic neutral.
Correct. So for me, this is Han Solo. Values his freedom, doesn't want to be tied down, at least in A New Hope. Eventually, he and Leia get together, and
True.
there's that. He joins the rebels. But in A New Hope, Han Solo is your classic chaotic neutral character.
True. He won't always do good, but he won't always do evil either. He's got a heart. He's got a sense of morality, but it's bendable.
Yeah. He doesn't care about laws at all.
He doesn't care about anybody's
smuggler.
law. Yeah. Significantly, he's in trouble with crime syndicates too. He's in trouble with governments and crime syndicates, every kind of code.
Exactly.
He's
How
trying to
can
figure out
he
how to get
make
around
the
it.
most money and survive and live freely?
Yep. Absolutely. Boba Fett too. We're leaning heavily in Star Wars because that's something we both know a lot.
Yeah.
So Boba Fett would be an example. And even I think Jack Sparrow, even though he's a pirate, he gives a surprising not amount of any care about the pirate code at all.
Yeah.
He will throw it to the wind. But he's not especially
uses it
evil.
when he needs to.
Yeah, he uses it when he needs to his advantage. But not because it's a code, not because he has a sense of honor. He doesn't seem to have it. Granted, I think I only saw the first movie, so I'm just going off of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it pretty much holds true through most of it. He accidentally does good, but most of it is what's going to serve him in the end the best.
Yeah. Yeah, but not to the point of making other people hurt too much. He does have a heart.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then there's lawful evil. The rules say that lawful evil characters methodically take what they want within the limits of a code of tradition, loyalty, or order. Devils and blue dragons are typically lawful evil. Devils are always lawful evil. I'm not sure why it's worded that way, because that's still the case, even after the typical revision that started to come with Monsters of the Multiverse. The Empire itself, as an organization, not a character, is the example of this. Like one of the best
ideals
examples
of the Empire.
Yeah, more important than anything. Yeah, and who gives a crap about the little guy? But interestingly, humans and humanoids, so our own kind, right, is more important to them than other kinds of sentient beings. That puts them squarely in the place of evil. And actually, they'll sacrifice their own people, right?
Right.
A lot of stuff in the EU started to talk about this. Yes, it's EU. It's not necessarily canon, but it's very consistent with the way the Empire is presented in the movies. Like the TIE fighters are built cheap and fast, and it doesn't matter if the pilot dies. They're dangerous, but they maneuver really tightly, if I remember that right. But above all, like, they don't care if the pilot dies, if it advances the goals of the Empire.
Right.
Which are also evil goals, we would all generally agree, I think.
Right.
Power, domination, and racism. Pretty much. Vader himself. In A New Hope and Empire.
And of specific individuals within the Empire, I would call Vader a lawful evil character.
Yeah, right up until his redemption at the very end of Return of the Jedi, where, he grows as a character, which can happen to your D&D character too, I guess. But up until that point, he's pretty solidly lawful evil. It's about the Sith code. Yeah. Doesn't matter who gets hurt. And it's about power. And he clearly would sacrifice his own family for that. Until he's redeemed.
Another one would be the Riddler. He has a very strict code of how he commits his evil acts. He gives riddles all the time and makes you figure out how to do that.
But if you do,
he'll give you the answer.
Yeah.
But he's trying to commit evil in that way.
Yeah, within his own weird system of laws.
Yeah.
I think you could make an argument that the Jigsaw Killer is lawful evil.
Okay.
But you might be lawful neutral. It also depends which Jigsaw movie we're talking about.
Right.
I'm not really sure, but that's a maybe for me for the Jigsaw guy. And there's neutral evil. The rules describe this as the alignment of those who do whatever they can get away with without compassion or qualms. Yugoloths are typically neutral evil. It's a funny example because that's not necessarily a household name monster for D&D.
Yeah.
We both, I think that Saruman is neutral evil. He doesn't care about the code with Sauron. He's playing both sides to his own advantage, but he's clearly thoroughly evil.
Right.
We don't exactly disagree about Magneto, but I think we have maybe different takes. I think Magneto is neutral evil because while he has an ideal that he's pro-mutant, and I'm not a big X-Men reader, but I think he's killed more than one mutant. He doesn't have a code about how to accomplish that goal. He just has the goal.
Fair.
That's my argument.
I'm not sure where I'd put Magneto. I don't think he's good. I think you could almost put him in true neutral or I think you could almost call him a true or a lawful evil or a true neutral.
Okay.
Reason being is I feel like he does have a code in some way that it is to protect mutant kind, whether it's protecting them from themselves. His goal is to protect mutant kind.
That's true.
And then you could make an argument whether a goal or a code are the same thing.
Right.
But I think that you could kind of finesse where Magneto goes, but that's a lot of these things. Again,
well, that's what's interesting about these alignments and talking about characters from fiction that are not D&D characters in a game who are more complicated. Yeah, I don't know. This is a great question. Is a goal the same thing as a code? I lean a little bit toward it's not, because everyone has goals.
Right.
But I also get the point that Magneto's goal is such a strongly held belief. It could be code adjacent.
Yes.
Finally, there's chaotic evil. So chaotic evil characters, according to the rules, act with arbitrary violence, are spurred by their greed, hatred, or bloodlust. Demons and red dragons are typically chaotic evil. There is a unmistakable, unmissable archetype we want to mention, which is
the Joker.
The Joker.
He is the poster boy for chaotic evil.
Actually loves the chaos itself. Not only does he not like laws, he actually loves chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe Emperor Palpatine. I think we disagreed about this too, because my notes from our prep have a question mark there.
Yeah, yeah.
But I've already forgotten who said what in that debate.
I believe that Emperor Palpatine is chaotic evil. I don't think he necessarily follows. Well, maybe he does. Maybe he follows his own code, but he flouts the rules of the Sith in getting rid of the rule of 2, creating the rule of 1. His whole goal is to become the one and only Sith Eternal.
But you could argue that that's a code, because you just made the argument.
I know, yeah. You could almost make the argument, yeah.
It's a code.
Yeah.
I remember why I put the question mark now, because I mostly agree with you, but I just have that question of, well, I feel like at some point Siths are supposed to try to kill each other. But then sometimes it's portrayed as that, they say there are always two, a servant and a master. Mm-hmm. And the next master is the servant who's supposed to kill the master. That is a kind of code.
And that's the rule of 2.
Yeah. But whether the master can kill the student, like the idea of being selfish enough to want there to be only one of you is, to me, baked into Sithness. Whether or not the rule of 2 is like as absolute as we think of it, and whether it's always been portrayed that way, I'm not sure. If so, then yeah, he's definitely... but he has his own code, though. His code is that there's going to be him. His code is that...
There will be only one Sith forever, and he will be all Sith.
You could interpret that as a code. It's gray. It's hazy.
Yeah.
And this alignment system is not perfect. You cannot... It's a fun exercise to come up with examples, because it can help us understand the alignment system, but I can't say this enough. Any example we draw from outside of a D&D game, this includes D&D characters in novels, who... That's not in a game where there's an alignment system per se. Right. Is generally going to be a little more complicated than this.
Yes.
Because it's not a game. And it's not dealing... They're not forced to deal with this heavy abstraction to make things fair, right? Or to make them consistent.
Again, most things are not black and white.
Right. And that gets back into this distinction of high fantasy, which D&D doesn't necessarily have to be. We'll hear more on that in a moment when I give my little perspective on all this. But I wanted to mention, because of its close history with D&D, it's worth noting here what Pathfinder is doing in Remastered, which came out just last year. Pathfinder Remastered is, they don't want to call it 3rd edition. They call it 2nd edition Remastered. I think there are enough changes to it that it is essentially a brand new edition. It's compatible with 2nd edition. Remastered can be played alongside the 2nd edition books. And so it's not really a new edition, I guess, but the changes are significant enough that it might as well be, I think. And one of those changes is that they completely dropped the alignment system in Remastered. Now they have things called edicts and anathema, and these are more like specific moral codes that say specific things, in the real world, a Buddhist being a vegetarian because of their faith would be an example of an edict for a cleric, I guess. For some reason, I can't think of a fantasy one. I can only think of a real world one. Not if you're Catholic and you don't eat meat on, is it every Friday? I'm not Catholic. I don't know how all that
I don't
works.
know, yeah.
Or some rules about Lent.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a great example. So rules you would follow during Lent, those would be edicts in the Pathfinder remastered system. Again, surprisingly, I can't come up with an actual fantasy example. I can only come up with real world examples. That's kind of weird. And then anathema would be things that you don't do because of a code. But these are specific things. This isn't this general good and evil, general lawful and neutral.
Well, I mean, it's like, think of Batman with this one.
Lawful and chaotic, I meant.
He will not kill.
Right. That's an edict.
Yeah.
Or that's an anathema.
Yeah.
Anathema, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, good example. And they can be tied to certain classes like clerics. They do have some limited in-game effects in some cases, the edicts and anathema, but they aren't this universal system. You know, unless you're playing a character or you choose to have edicts, which you can do, you don't really have to burden yourself with it either. And probably, I mean, if I'm running a Pathfinder game and I do want to pick up that system, brush up on it and run some of that soon, I could see myself game mastering that system saying, you know, you can discover your edicts and anathema as you role play, because that kind of openness seems, unless you're a cleric who has to have that kind of system feels like something you would discover as you play your character.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I think people find the classic D&D alignments a little uncomfortable. It's like, I got to choose my major already and I don't even know.
Right.
I'm in high school and I got to already choose my college major. It's kind of like how some people don't like to do that. Like, I got to figure a lot of stuff out by living my life, you know? You write the story as you play, really.
Yeah.
It's difficult for a lot of us to come up with this fleshed out backstory that not only is fully fleshed out, but we want to be stuck with it. Right? You discover a lot of things during play, which brings us to kind of my take on all this. Some people consider the alignment system as it exists in D&D to be outdated, and would even argue that Remastered removed it because it's outdated, and that just feels better, and it's what more people want. I think there's a truth to it. But I don't think that's entirely true. One of the reasons, or perhaps the reason it was removed from Pathfinder, was because Remastered was in large part a response to the OGL debacle earlier that year. Second edition was going along just fine, doing whatever it was doing that was a lot like D&D, but still its own take on it. Mm-hmm. When that OGL thing happened, Paizo came right out, Paizo, the publisher of Pathfinder games, came right out and said, you know, we're going to remove OGL dependency in our remastered edition. I don't even remember if they were planning to do a remastered edition before that happened.
Yeah, I have no idea.
This alignment, this 9 alignment system is so close to D&D itself. Like a lot of other things they got rid of, I think that's the reason they wanted to get rid of it. So it isn't necessarily, at least in Paizo's case, I don't know that it's because this concept is now lived out its life and it's not useful anymore. I don't think so. I think that this kind of system is perfect if you want to run a very classic, high fantasy, good versus evil type of game. But it's not really that important for heroic fantasy or sword and sorcery. Other genres of fantasy that are very playable in D&D, D&D works great with those too, don't really need that alignment system, and it would feel like a burden. You know, if you're running this very Lord of the Rings type of like, there's a dark force in the world, and it made very dark things, and, you know, you interact with these things, and you're, you know, part of this evil cult, that type of thing. That makes sense. If you want to run a Conan-like game, or, you know, just a pulp, any kind of pulp-like fantasy game, these things are relatively meaningless. Evil's there, but the morality of a player character, do we have to have it so tightly defined? Does it need to be part of the magic system? Things like that. It's not really anymore in 5th edition, so maybe not a great example, but I guess I say that partly because I wish it was. Ultimately, what I wish I could have is an optional alignment system that I could drop into games that I want to be very high fantasy, where there's a dark evil, and it's a dangerous evil that seduces people, and, you know, it's a growing shadow over the world, and it's monolithic and black and white. That's not a great way to look at the real world, but I still think it's a fun kind of escapist, mythological take on a game where we all understand that reality isn't that way. It can be an escape from the complicated type of moral decisions we have to make in the real world, which we should take seriously and should look at in nuance. The kind of super good and evil high fantasy is a fun escape from that when you play pretend. But it's also fun to play that sword and sorcery type of story where everyone's kind of out for themselves. Honor Among Thieves, I think. The D&D movie is, surprisingly, we're talking about how classic D&D it is to have alignments. Mm-hmm. Those characters are more like, that's a sword and sorcery story, really. It's not a high fantasy story. It's not Lord of the Rings. No. It's a band of misfits who come together to do something in the name of good. Yes, That's about all we know, and we don't really need it to be overly simplified or spelled out into categories for us, ironically, in the D&D movie. But also, it'd be an interesting optional addition to other types of stories you want to run. If you wanted to take D&D and do a Weird West game with it, which you can totally do. There are rules for firearms out there somewhere in one of the supplements. I forget which one, right? You could do that. If you wanted to run a more typical Weird West, like we see in a lot of other dedicated Weird West games, morality system like this is a burden. I don't think it's necessary. But if you wanted to run something like Dark Tower, where you've got, Sir Roland, who comes from this class of knights who happen to wear chaps and ride horses and hand make revolvers and hand make bullets, and they're Western characters, but they're in this world that's a lot like, and in fact, it was Stephen King's answer to Lord of the Rings. He said that he wanted to write an American version of that type of fantasy epic. You're going to do that? I think that these two axes would be interesting for that. And I think finding items that were inherently evil or coming across entities that are just inherently evil, and this morality is very black and white, makes sense in that kind of story too. I wish I had the option to drop it in, but I also don't like being stuck with it in any D&D game that I run.
I kind of agree with you in some of these things. I dislike a lot of the more black and white parts of it. The good, there's absolute good and absolute evil. For me, a lot of it comes down to nuance. Sometimes it's really nice to use the morality system to initially start your character creation. Gives you just kind of a guideline on how your character is going to react throughout this campaign and to certain things. But it's really easy to abandon that. Most of the characters I build, I choose an alignment, and then 30 seconds later, that alignment is nothing what that actual character really follows. Because it's really restrictive if you follow a specific alignment all the time. For me, it creates a boring character. There's, again, nuance to everything, allowing that character to grow and build and change. And while, yes, the system does allow for that, I feel like it still forces you into a specific box.
It allows for it, but it doesn't necessarily reward that kind of evolution.
I do like the idea of having truly evil and truly good objects. But I think that those objects could more act like cursed or blessed items.
Sure.
Causing you to do more evil things or more good things.
Tempting, maybe.
Yeah, tempting you, but not solely forcing you to be a good aligned or evil aligned character. Even in high fantasy, I think with initial world building, I think that comes down to, hey, there's our big BBEG. And you guys are the good guys. But leaving room for nuance and change, it makes for a better story in my mind.
Yeah.
I think that allowing things into the world, like the evil guy may be doing something evil, but not necessarily because he's an evil guy. He may be doing it because, again, the needs of the many maybe outweigh the needs of the few, or the other way around. An idea that I have would be a necromancer raising the town that is dead, but maybe because they were sick with a plague and he was sad by the death of all these people, but everybody sees necromancy as evil and want to kill the necromancer.
That's not because of the necromancer's alignment.
Right.
D&D would allow for that character.
Yes, but I think that most would find, if you're thinking BBEG, so if you're looking at a black and white, he would be the evil bad guy in most people's minds, that he's not doing good necessarily because it's necromancy. That's why I think you get problems with a black and white game. And yes, D&D allows for that. The morality system would allow for that. But I think a lot of times you would play him and he'd be the evil guy.
That's true. What I find interesting while I listen to you make this point is that there are examples of this all over the Lord of the Rings, which I keep invoking as the
Yeah.
classic high fantasy black and white good and evil, but it is in fact a really nuanced story.
Right.
Aragorn brings a bunch of dead warriors back to life. I don't think he does it directly. It's just something he discovers and he persuades them to help him.
Yeah.
So necromancy is fuzzy, if you want to call it necromancy. You could get out through a technical loophole and say that wasn't necromantic magic. I think that was just what in my games I sometimes call the Orlais. I'm borrowing I think a Celtic word that means kind of like fate.
Yeah.
They were caught up in this fate of being massacred, and they're revenants basically. They're that archetype of revenant. They weren't raised by any one mage or anything, but this sort of blessing / curse thing happened to them. But anyway, the Temptation of the Ring itself makes a lot of characters behave differently. And it isn't necessarily because of the magic. I mean, that's there, but also Boromir is a great example of somebody who wasn't really an evil guy, but was complicated. And he wanted to use the ring for good. Let's take this evil thing and use it for good.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of times you could have evil from one person's perspective be good, or from one perspective, the evil could be good, whereas some others would think it's evil. Does that make sense?
Yes. My initial reaction is now you're talking about the real world and not high fantasy. But is there an example like from Lord of the Rings or another type of high fantasy thing where you can give an example of that being
not
dealt
off
with?
the top of my head? No,
there might be. I'm asking because I think I'm not asking to disagree. I'm asking because I think you probably could come up with an example. Above all, the thing I like about all this stuff is it makes for a lot of interesting conversations. And whether you keep the alignment system or scrap it in your game or you decide to play Pathfinder, these are neat things to talk about. Yeah. These are things that come into play in stories, and they even make you think about decisions in your real life. I don't know. I'm that big D&D nerd that will occasionally, the game is so much a part of my life, especially now that I do this channel, that I will sometimes think about like, wait, was that an evil action? In the sense that, was this just selfish and it hurt someone else?
I have not had that.
No? Keep playing.
Right, yeah. Play more.
Keep co-hosting. You'll get there.
Yeah.
Like real world morality itself, this topic is surprisingly complex for a simple abstract system and very open to interpretation. If you've got thoughts on it, by all means, leave us a comment.